Hello dear participants, now let's start with module 4.6, Climate and Environmental Projects in Public Procurement. Spotting corruption, substandard or undelivered output versus payment during contract implementation. Now let's start with the reporting template. This webinar is designed to guide you through the monitoring process in a clear and structured way. It follows the same logic as the report for monitoring projects. The reporting template is divided into 3 steps. Step 1 is the desk analysis. This is where you review the contract information and spot potential corruption risks. Step 2 focuses on contract implementation, checking whether the project is being carried out as promised on the ground. And Step 3 looks at results and impact, evaluating whether the outcomes match the objectives and serve the public interest. In today's webinar, we'll be focusing on Step 2 of contract implementation for climate and environmental projects. Specifically, we'll look at how corruption schemes can emerge when payments are made for outputs that are either substandard or not delivered at all. Our goal is to understand how these risks appear in practice and what can be done to spot them early. One of the most efficient methods for spotting red flags in public procurement is by directly observing what is happening at the construction site. It is here, on the ground, that discrepancies between contract terms and actual implementation become visible. Signs such as delays in progress, substitution of agreed materials, or unexplained changes in scope can all indicate potential risks. Careful monitoring ensures that the project remains transparent, accountable, and aligned with its intended purpose. By watching closely, we safeguard public resources and guarantee that the work, such as planting new greenery in our neighborhood, truly delivers value to the community and protects our environment. So let's start with a little quiz. The question is, how can a citizen contribute to oversight during contract implementation? Possible answers. A. Avoid involvement and stay neutral. Answer B. Only act if invited by officials. And answer C. Monitor project progress and compare with official plans. Please take your time, don't hurry, and I will give you 30 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is answer C. Why? Active civic engagement is essential for transparency, and by comparing actual progress with official plans, citizens can detect discrepancies early. This vigilance strengthens democratic oversight and deters corrupt practices. Now, a real-life based example. I'll share with you a very inspiring story showing that we, the people, can really make a difference. Trakai is a region in Lithuania that's famous not just for its beautiful castle and lakes, but also for its rich mix of forests and biodiversity. The whole area is part of the Trakai Historical National Park, which covers forests, hills, and wetlands. This park is unique. It's actually the only historical national park in Europe, and it's been recognized for both its cultural heritage and its natural landscapes. In the lakeside town of Trakai, Lithuania, EU funds arrived with a promise: protect and restore biodiversity. Citizens imagined healthier forests, native plants returning, and habitats safeguarded. But when the project began, the reality was very different. Instead of ecological restoration, contractors moved in with chainsaws and bulldozers. Hundreds of trees, many of them healthy, some even protected, were cut down. Officials claimed they were dangerous or blocking paths, but locals saw beloved greenery vanish. Citizens walking through Trakai's park noticed the mismatch. Where they expected restored habitats, they found manicured lawns and concrete paths. The EU's biodiversity money had been spent, but biodiversity itself was poorer than before. Documentary makers and reporters began to investigate. For instance, Lithuanian journalist Elena received messages from activists across the country about trees being felled, and she focused on Trakai as one of the most striking cases. Together with colleagues, she uncovered that EU biodiversity money was being misused to finance the removal of trees in a protected national park. Here we can see the classic corruption scheme of substandard or undelivered output versus payment. Funds were allocated to protect biodiversity, but instead they financed tree removal, herbicide spraying and paving. Citizens ended up paying for projects that not only failed to deliver ecological benefits, but actively harmed the environment. A clear red flag is when the outputs don't match the stated objectives. Biodiversity money funding construction work is a mismatch that should raise suspicion. So how it was exposed? Activist campaigns. Local campaigners publicly opposed the project, pointing out that Trakai's old town risked losing a fifth of its trees. Media investigations. Journalists documented the contradiction between EU funding goals and the actual destruction of biodiversity. And legal action. Environmental authorities intervened and eventually the Vilnius District Administrative Court revoked permits for tree cutting in Trakai's old town. Now let's take a look at another real-life based example. Let's begin with Albania. The government signed contracts for three major waste incinerators in Tirana, Fier and Elbasan. The incinerators were presented as self-sufficient energy recovery plants. With a sufficient supply of waste for incineration, the money gained from selling the energy could be used to keep the incinerator operational. These projects were presented as modern solutions to the country's waste crisis, and huge sums of public money were paid out in advance. But when citizens looked around, what did they see? Empty construction sites, half-finished facilities, and plants that simply weren't working. The promised infrastructure never materialized, yet the payments kept flowing. At the time, the two incinerators in Elbasan and Fier operate under capacity, while the facility in Tirana only contains a landfill and not an incinerator. Environmental inspections and site visits are not carried out at the three locations, according to the interviews. The amount of waste being recycled has decreased. There is also no separation of different waste streams at the source, as the strategy was designed for all the waste to be incinerated, which means that the environmental impact can be assumed to be considerable. This is a textbook case of corruption, where money leaves the public purse, but the promised output is either substandard or never delivered at all. For ordinary people, it meant paying for empty promises, while waste continued to pile up. In case of this project in Albania, The red flags of corruption also come from the way those contracts were set up. For example, there were no rules tying payments to the actual progress of the work. And on top of that, the contracts were written in euros, which meant the government had to cover all the costs of currency conversions. And another real-life based example, this time in Poland. Irregularities in 32 out of the 34 heat pump models were discovered. Most of the problems were with the paperwork. The product information sheet and the EU declaration of conformity were either filled out incorrectly or missing completely. On top of that, there were frequent mistakes with the energy efficiency labels and the technical documentation. Every single one of those models had at least two issues, and in one case, all of these problems showed up at once. And another real-life based example, this time from North Macedonia. People in the neighborhood first noticed something unusual. Around the hospital buildings, thick smoke started to rise from the chimneys, and the air quality seemed to get worse day by day. Families living nearby complained about the smell. Staff inside the hospital felt the air was heavy, and patients, already vulnerable, were breathing in polluted air. What looked like a normal heating system was actually burning fuel that was never meant to be used in hospitals. The State Market Inspectorate in North Macedonia stopped a train carrying oil and decided to check its quality. When they tested it, they found the samples were way too thick compared to normal heating oil. One of the officials even said you could tell just by looking at it that it wasn't the usual stuff. This fuel oil was being used for heating by big companies. And because it was bought through the public procurement system, it ended up in the boilers of the Ministry of Defense, Skopje's Public Transport Authority, and even in 7 state hospitals and maternity hospitals. Behind the smoke was a corruption scheme. Hazardous oil, classified as waste, was imported and sold as heating fuel. On paper, everything looked fine. Contracts signed, invoices paid, deliveries confirmed. But in reality, the hospitals were not receiving proper fuel. They were receiving toxic waste disguised as energy. This allowed companies and officials to profit, while citizens paid the price with their health. So how could citizens recognize such a scheme? One of the clearest signs is when the quality of the service doesn't match the payment. The hospitals paid for clean heating oil, but the product delivered was visibly polluting. The smoke and smell were obvious indicators that something was wrong. Transparency was missing. No clear testing or verification of the fuel quality was shared with the public. When citizens see a mismatch between what's promised and what's delivered, whether it's bad roads after expensive repairs, missing school supplies after big budgets, or toxic smoke from clean fuel, that's a red flag for corruption.
Let me present you another example of a project, a case where green energy went seriously off track. Across the Balkans, small hydropower plants were promoted as a part of the EU's push for renewable energy. On paper, it sounded great: clean energy, local development and sustainability. But unfortunately, in reality, many of these projects cause serious environmental damage. These projects often diverted water from natural streams, drying up riverbeds and threatening biodiversity and local agriculture. In countries like Serbia, Albania, dozens of these plants were built with EU support. But here's the problem. Many of them skipped key environmental checks and didn't have a detailed impact assessments or proper environmental oversight. Some were built without proper permits, and even when violations were obvious, authorities rarely stepped in. In Serbia, for example, 24 out of 116 hydropower plants connected to the grid in 2019 lacked environmental permits. Only 3 cases were investigated, but none led to prosecution. What made it worse was the role of public money. EU institutions, including the European Investment Bank, helped fund these projects. But the oversight was weak, and in some cases, developers were able to bypass regulations and profit while nature paid the price. Local communities, activists and environmental groups have raised concerns about corruption, collusion between developers and local authorities, and of course misuse of public funds. This lack of transparency and accountability has allowed developers to bypass regulations and profit from environmentally harmful projects. This corruption scheme was revealed through a combination of administrative review, investigative journalism, and the local community feedback. Because from the beginning discrepancies in project documentation raised concerns. Local communities played a critical role in flagging environmental damage. In areas like Kamenagura, residents reported diverted streams and disrupted ecosystems, which directly impacted their livelihoods. These reports prompted further scrutiny. Investigative journalists conducted in-depth reviews of public records, construction permits and environmental assessments. Their findings revealed a pattern of regulatory violations and weak oversight. Ultimately, the detection of corruption risk was due to inconsistencies in documentation, lack of enforcement, and the visible disconnect between project goals and on-the-ground impact. This case underscores the importance of transparency, strict monitoring and community engagement in safeguarding public investments. So our role is very important. Look at this photograph. You may see here the tragic incident that occurred near Savona in northern Italy on November 24, 2019. This accident serves as a stark reminder of the critical importance of infrastructure resilience. This bridge was intended to facilitate safe and efficient travel across a region that is known for its very challenging terrain. This collapse of a 30-meter section of a bridge was triggered by a landslide following heavy rainfall. Fortunately, no lives were lost, but this event could have easily resulted in fatalities. I'd like to share with you another example, a case of a EU-funded project for extraordinary measures such as landslide mitigation and firefighting equipment. Despite the project's great purpose, unfortunately the funds were diverted by a regional in-house environmental agency to cover just routine activities. Investigations revealed that misleading project descriptions had been used to secure more than 80 million euro, which then was misused. This fraud was uncovered following by an anonymous whistleblower tip, leading to criminal proceedings, house arrests and convictions of the agency managers. there are also other projects where what was promised didn't match what was actually delivered. In fact, several applications for EU funds were submitted with almost identical descriptions, which tell us that probably there wasn't much genuine site-specific planning. What's more, some of these projects related to protection from landslides were carried out in areas already scheduled for routine maintenance instead of focusing on the zones most at risk from landslides. That completely undermined the purpose of the funding. In this particular case, a big share of the money went not to emergency measures, but to everyday expenses like staff salaries and overtime, and in one shocking case, public workers were even sent to renovate the private home of a senior manager, what is an obvious misuse of public resources. What is striking is that the oversight didn't catch these problems in time. The managing authority failed to properly supervise the implementing agency, and inspections were either late or too weak. In the end, it was an anonymous whistleblower who exposed the misconduct, showing just how important civic monitoring is in protecting integrity. This case is a strong reminder: transparency, accountability, and active citizen engagement are not optional. They are simply essential. And if we want public funds to truly serve the public good, we should look around carefully. What can we do to identify red flags? First of all, observe project execution in your area. If you notice that projects are being carried out in areas that don't match the stated goals, that's a red flag. Compare project descriptions across regions, because identical or copy-paste project plans may indicate fraudulent intent. Remember that citizens can always request access to project documentation under transparency laws. Track budget allocations and outcomes. If large sums are allocated, but there is very little visible progress on the site, then it is worth asking where the money went. Report suspicious activity. You can use anonymous whistleblower channels or contact local prosecutors or anti-fraud offices if you suspect any misuse. Engage with local media or NGOs. Sharing concerns with journalists or watchdog organizations can amplify scrutiny and lead to investigations. Attend public meetings and ask questions. Citizens can challenge officials directly about project scope, contractor selection, and budget use. Time for a short quiz. A renewable energy project promises major results with minimal funding and staff. What should this raise? Confidence in their efficiency? Suspicion of unrealistic claims? Or support for fast-tracking approval? The correct answer is B, because overpromising with limited resources often signals false claims or misrepresentation. In such cases, monitor or the citizen should begin by reviewing publicly available project documents, such as funding applications, progress reports, or environmental impact assessments. If the claim appears unsupported or overly ambitious, it is appropriate to report the concern to relevant oversight bodies. These may include local government offices, national anti-corruption agencies, or EU institutions if the project is externally funded. Responsible reporting helps ensure that public resources are used effectively and that projects are grounded in realistic, achievable goals. Let's start with a second question. You notice that a project's progress reports don't match the original proposal. What is the best next step? A. Ignore it. It's probably a reporting error. B. Assume the project changed direction. C. Report the inconsistency to the oversight bodies. And the correct answer is C. Because inconsistencies in documentation can indicate fraud and should be reported for further investigation. When a citizen notices that a project's progress reports do not align with its original proposal, whether in terms of timelines, deliverables, or outcomes, it may indicate poor management or deliberate deception. The appropriate response is to document the inconsistencies clearly. This includes noting specific discrepancies and, if possible, collecting supporting evidence from public records or official communications. The concern should be then submitted to the relevant authority, such as the project's funding agency or a local audit office or anti-fraud institution. By reporting these inconsistencies, citizens contribute to transparency and help prevent the misuse of public funds. It is important to approach the matter factually and respectfully, focusing on the need for clarification and accountability. And the last question. A hydropower plant is built in a protected area without visible permits. What does this suggest? A. The project is environmentally friendly. B. There may be a violation of environmental laws. C. Permits are not needed for green projects. And the correct answer is B. Because lack of permits in protected areas for infrastructure projects is a strong indicator of regulatory violations or corruption. If a citizen observes that a public project, such as a hydropower plant, is being built in a protected area without visible permits or public consultation, this is a serious red flag. In this situation, a citizen should first verify whether the project has been publicly listed or approved by the appropriate environmental authority. If no permits are found, or if the project appears to bypass legal procedures, the concern should be reported to environmental protection agencies, local government offices, or watchdog organizations. Citizens play indeed a vital role in safeguarding natural resources. By raising concerns about unauthorized construction, they help to ensure that development respects both the law and the environment. Well done. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. We hope these red flags indicators can be useful tools to help strengthen the way we monitor climate-related public procurement and make the process more transparent. Thank you.